Throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, Sony enjoyed a period of dominance unlike anything seen in the video game industry up to that point. They had put down their rivals in Nintendo and Sega, the latter of which quite literally, with Sega bowing out of the console space in 2002 and seeing off a new challenger of Microsoft and their debut, the Xbox. The PS2 was the most successful console in history, a triumph that even today has not yet been matched. Sony's push into the 7th console generation started in 2001, a year after the release of the PS2, with the announcement of a partnership between Sony, IBM and Toshiba on what would become the next generation of hardware. This partnership gave birth to what would become known as the Cell microprocessor. Sony invested in this partnership heavily, costing somewhere in the region of $400 million, the initial hope being that it could be used in laptops, mobile phones and other devices, alongside the PS3, in order to offset its high cost. Unfortunately, this never happened, and it was only used exclusively in the PS3. The Cell was an incredibly advanced and powerful bit of technology, however it had the downside of being incredibly difficult to develop for, with Gabe Newell of Valve famously calling it a waste of time. As a result of this, the console's true potential wasn't really realised for several years after launch. While this isn't particularly unusual, the generation's best games tend to come towards its end, early efforts were often subpar compared to the versions seen on Microsoft's platform. This did improve over the system's life, with games like The Last of Us squeezing every bit of power out of the PS3 possible, but it was a bumpy road early on. The push to fully 3D worlds that started on the PS1 and expanded on during the PS2's life gradually began to increase the size of games. The push to higher resolutions in the 7th gen had much the same effect. In much the same way the PS1 adopted CDs as its medium of choice, and the PS2 made an early push for DVDs, the PS3 used the new Blu-ray format developed by Sony. Blu-ray offered a lot of the same advantages that DVDs had over CDs, primarily massively expanded storage, around 5 times that of a DVD initially, and even more when later iterations became available. This served a double purpose though. Blu-ray players in 2006 were retailing for up to $1,000, so a PlayStation at around half that price that also played games continued to be a no-brainer for both Sony and the public alike. The PS3 was initially developed with a full suite of backwards compatibility features. Both PS1 and PS2 games would work natively on the console, with the original game disc working out of the box. However, unlike the previous console, no hardware would work moving forward. The inclusion of a hard drive of memory cards meant that there was just no need to include support for them, and the move to wireless controllers and USB as a standard interface removed any possibility of legacy controller support. A full suite of multimedia features were developed for the PS3, with early models even having a flashcard reader built into the console. It was an extensive feature set, with audio and video streaming offered online or over a local network, as well as the ability to store and view digital photographs that could be transferred from almost any USB device. E3 2005 saw the official unveiling of the PlayStation 3 to the public, a sleek silver machine with an unusual banana-shaped controller, but would later be revealed as a prototype, with launch models taking on a design very similar to all previous iterations. It was announced that 2 models would be available on launch, a 20GB model retailing at $499 and a 60GB version at an eye-watering $600. This was a far cry from previous generations, when Sony's offerings were often seen as incredibly affordable relative to the competition. This was primarily down to the fact that Sony made a loss on every PS3 sold, even at those prices. The enormous cost of the Cell processor's development, coupled with the fact that the PS2 was basically included in every PS3 to support backwards compatibility, amongst other things. It didn't take long for Sony to release a new model, removing the backwards compatibility and features such as the card reader to dramatically reduce costs. As such, these early models are quite sought after and are becoming quite expensive. There is still no way to play PS2 games on an original unmodified hardware beyond the early PS3s. The PS3 released on November 11, 2006 in Japan, and a few days later in North America. Europe had to wait a further 4 months until March 2007 to get their hands on the new hardware. In Europe, the PS3 sold over 500,000 units in its first 2 days of sale, consequently becoming the second fastest selling console in the UK, with 165,000 units sold during those 2 opening days, just behind the PSP. However, in its second week, sales were down by as much as 80%. Launch titles were a mixed bag, shipping with 14 in North America and 24 in Europe. Ridge Racer 7, MotorStorm and Resistance Fall of Man stood out, with the rest being mediocre at best. A host of sports games including 2 NBA titles for some reason, Need for Speed Carbon and what will be the beginning of the end for the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater series in Project 8. Considering the Xbox 360 had been around a full year at this point, the lineup was lackluster at best. Reactions to the PlayStation 3 around launch were mixed. A large number of reviews were incredibly critical of the high launch price and low number of high quality games on offer, but did praise the console for being an impressive technical showcase. This started to improve over the console's life once the price was reduced, and high quality games started to be released. Developers outside of Sony's own first party studios generally found the hardware to be difficult and complicated to develop for. As mentioned before, Gabe Newell of Valve was less than complimentary about the PS3, though something must have changed at some point because Valve released the Orange Box and Portal 2 on it anyway. The 7th console generation is one of poor performance across the board. Difficulties while developing due to the architecture, push for higher fidelity and resolutions, and a trend towards cinematic gameplay resulted in a lot of games with low frame rates, too much bloom and motion blur, and a look that is synonymous with the era. Modern military shooters and Unreal Engine being the dominant technology at the time led to a lot of games with a very similar look and feel. There was a lot of grey-brown rooms, sepia filters, and desaturated colour palettes. Which is a shame, because the push for HD resolutions and flat panel TVs becoming more prevalent really did lend themselves to bright, vibrant colours. Games such as Borderlands 2 and Sonic Generations that leaned into a colourful art style still hold up really well today. Increasing game sizes combined with the inclusion of a hard drive as standard started a push towards installing games to the console before they could be played. It wasn't enforced on the PS3 in all games, unlike with later generations, but it started to become prevalent by the end of the console's life in order to reduce loading times wherever possible. The PS3 was officially discontinued in 2016, with the last game being released in August of 2020. It became the 8th best-selling console ever, with 87 million units being sold, eventually beating the Xbox 360, which had generally been ahead across the generation, in part due to it getting a 12-month head start over the PS3. Both were massively outsold by the Wii though, which broke 100 million units sold without any real effort. Over the course of the PS3's life, 3 models were released. The original launch model and 2 subsequently smaller models, the Slim in 2009 and the Super Slim in 2012. The Slim was largely the same as the original launch unit, albeit with a matte finish and a low profile, as a result of improvements in the cell's manufacturing, which had the added benefit of low power consumption and quieter running due to the better cooling efficiency. The Super Slim was smaller still, with the main difference being the method in which the discs were loaded. Both the original and the Slim had a front-loading disc tray that sucked in the disc, much the same way as a car CD player would. The Super Slim, however, switched to a top-loading design similar to that of the PS1, with a sliding door to access it. By this point, hard drive size had increased dramatically over the launch models, with up to 500GB being available, nearly 10 times that of the base launch unit. Controllers remained largely unchanged from the PS2, at least visually. The long cable connected to the console was gone, instead going with a wireless Bluetooth solution, with controllers only needing to be connected by USB occasionally to charge the internal battery. A welcome move of a Microsoft solution, which required players to provide their own batteries. Launching with what was known as the 6-axis controller, as the name suggests, it featured 6 degrees of freedom for motion controls to be implemented in games. Early in the console's life, games shoehorned these controls in often wherever possible. It worked well enough. As with all motion controls, the lack of any kind of physical feedback limited its usefulness and it often felt like a token feature. Speaking of feedback, the 6-axis launched with no force feedback whatsoever, Sony stating that they felt that it would interfere with the motion controls. A significant step back from the DualShock controllers used in the PS1 and 2. In 2008 though, an updated version of the controller was released that re-added the vibration function. A firmware update in 2009 added stereoscopic 3D capabilities to the console, allowing compatible games to be played on 3D-enabled TVs. Only a small number of games took advantage of the feature, with only 78 having any kind of support. I never owned a 3D capable TV, so I haven't been able to ever try any of these games out, despite owning a reasonable selection of them. Sony, like Microsoft, put a much greater emphasis on their online connectivity this time around, with a fully featured online service available from launch. PlayStation Network included a digital storefront where players could buy and download games, demos and trailers. Online play was now the rule rather than the exception, though this had the unfortunate side effect of having local multiplayer becoming far less common. Unlike Microsoft's service, this was all entirely free. No subscription was required to play online and chat with friends. In 2010, Sony introduced an optional subscription service called PlayStation Plus. This offered a monthly collection of games that are free to keep while the subscription is active. It also added exclusive discounts to the store and access to a cloud save system. An increasing presence of social media in everyday life prompted Sony to attempt its own social network of sorts in the form of PlayStation Home. Launching on PS3 as a beta in 2008, Home was a 3D space that was interacted with in much the same way as any other game would be. It allowed players to chat and interact freely in a variety of different areas. Players had a personal room that could be decorated with digital photographs and premium items available from the store. Games could be launched directly from Home, and some games were developed specifically to integrate with it. I didn't personally use Home much. It seemed like more of a novelty even back in 2008. Facebook was well established by that point, but the service apparently had enough of a user base to keep it going, as it wasn't shut down until 2015. Square Enix's initial foray into MMOs with Final Fantasy XI had been very successful, with multiple console releases and complete cross-platform play among them. The follow-up, Final Fantasy XIV, aimed to continue this trend. The game's initial launch in 2010 was fraught with problems, and as such didn't release on consoles, but that's a video for another day. In 2013 it was re-released as Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, a complete overhaul of the game, and it hit PlayStation 3 on day one. Continuing to have full cross-platform play, and no region blocks allowing players from anywhere in the world to play together, albeit this time with just PC and PlayStation. It continues to thrive today, making the leap to PS4 and recently to PS5, continuing the tradition of complete freedom to play with anyone else who plays the game, regardless of platform or location. In 2002, Sony released an add-on kit allowing users to turn their PS2s into a Linux-based home computer. This trend continued with the PS3. OtherOS was a feature available on early models that allowed the installation of another operating system in much the same way the PS2 had. OtherOS was removed from all PS3s in a firmware update in April of 2010, with Sony citing security concerns as the reason. Later that month, several class action lawsuits were filed against Sony, claiming that the removal of OtherOS was unfair and deceptive and a breach of good faith. In 2016, Sony settled with users in the US, offering $55 to those who used PS3 for its OtherOS functionality. Up until this point, the PS3 had not been hacked in any meaningful way, aside from mod chips, which wasn't a viable option for a lot of users. Upon the removal of OtherOS, Failoverflow jailbroke the PS3's firmware, enabling homebrew and disabling all of the security, which led to increased levels of piracy. 2011 wasn't a great year for PlayStation. On April 17th through to April 19th, the PlayStation Network was hacked. Somewhere in the region of 77 million accounts were compromised, with users' personal information being stolen. The following day, Sony disabled the service completely for several weeks. It became one of the largest data breaches ever recorded. An update was released for the console that forced users to change their passwords, in order to limit any potential damage or loss of accounts, and the selection of PS3 and PSP games were offered as free compensation to the 77 million users affected. Sony were investigated over the breach and fined £250,000 under the Data Protection Act in the UK. Further to this, a lawsuit was filed against Sony, alleging that, amongst other things, they had failed to encrypt data and establish adequate firewalls to handle a server intrusion. However, the lawsuit was dismissed in 2012. Sony reportedly lost $171 million as a result of the hack, with the company being down around $3 billion for the year due to a massive earthquake that rocked Japan earlier on in the same year. The 7th console generation ended up being my favourite, and I've never really been able to put my finger on why that is. The time was split roughly 50-50 between the PS3 and the Xbox 360, and I don't have a particular fondness for one console over the other. It was a generation of great games, marred by poor performance and oversaturation of certain genres. A technical powerhouse, the PS3 was easily the most advanced console around at the time, unfortunately held back by an initial high price and lack of games due to it being difficult to develop for. Sony faced an uphill battle from day one, with the Xbox 360 releasing a year earlier and the Nintendo Wii being the most sought after gadget for several years running. It wasn't Sony's finest hour, but going one better than they did with the PS2 was always going to be a monumental task. They eventually came good though, marginally beating Microsoft in sales and pushing the industry forward in regard to a console's role in the home, with the inclusion of streaming and social media features. As always, if you've managed to get this far into the video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. Do you have fond memories of the PS3, or did you sit firmly on Team Green or Red with the Xbox 360 and Wii? Let me know down in the comments.